Hello, everybody. I'm Eli Lake, here on Blogging Heads today with Peter Beinart, the author of The Icarus Syndrome and a recent essay in the New York Review of Books on the state of liberal Zionism. Peter, thanks for doing this. I should say we did record something on Friday, but for technical reasons, we don't have it. So this is our second attempt at this discussion.
That's right. It was sabotaged by either AIPAC, J Street, or Hamas.
There you go. All right, so why don't you start off, Peter? Summarize the argument in the essay.
Sure. So the argument in the essay is that among younger secular Jews, connection to Israel is in dramatic decline, and that one of the reasons is that those Jews have liberal values that are not consistent with the leadership of the organized American Jewish community's decision to not publicly criticize Israel, particularly this Israeli government, which I argue has very strongly kind of illiberal and authoritarian leanings.
Illiberal and authoritarian leanings.
Yeah.
All right, you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, you have Avigdor Lieberman as deputy prime minister and foreign minister who has a background in Kach, Meir Kahane's racist party, which explicitly supported physical expulsion of the Palestinians, and Lieberman has made a big part of his political agenda an effort to kind of delegitimize Arab Israelis, accuse them of to just take away some of their rights, accuse them of treason. You have a Shas party which has an extraordinarily kind of illiberal worldview, with its spiritual leader Ovadia Yosef having called Palestinians ants and snakes, and calling for Ariel Sharon to be struck down by God after he withdrew settlements from Gaza. And you have Benjamin Netanyahu, who has a lifelong, and I think unchanged, deep hostility to the idea of a Palestinian state. So I think, all in all, I think and has led a kind of an attempt at real crackdown against Israeli human rights organizations. So I think it's a really illiberal, authoritarian kind of government.
Crackdown against human rights organizations?
Yeah, I mean, the effort to kind of change the tax status, the campaign against the New Israel Fund to make it basically harder for Israeli human rights organizations to get support from abroad. I think that's part of an effort, basically, to try to respond not only to the criticism that the Israeli government has gotten from international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, but very much, I think they feel even more threatened in many ways by groups like Breaking the Silence, which come from within Israel itself and indeed among former Israeli soldiers.
Well, I mean, that's a wild card. I don't remember that in your essay, and I have to say I'm not entirely up to speed on that. But I want to get back to Bibi Netanyahu. I'm really. Why do you think a 1993 campaign book is a better indication of Netanyahu's views than the public speeches he's given as prime minister in the late 1990s and currently, or for that matter, agreeing to the temporary settlement freeze, including natural growth, or any number of other things? I mean, Peter, you of all people know what it's like to change your mind. I mean, you.
Sure,
I mean,
sure. Go ahead, Phil. I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead, finish.
Well, no. I'm just saying. I think that the view of Netanyahu in particular, it doesn't even account for. I mean, it's another weakness in the essay. I think is that you capture one side of a kind of paradox right now about Israeli politics, which is that, yeah, it's true that the current coalition in Israeli government is probably as far to the right as, we know of, at least since the era of the peace process. To give a sense of that, Meretz and Labor in 1992 have nearly half the votes in the Knesset. Meretz and Labor today have 16 votes in the Knesset. And so there is a sense that Israeli public has moved to the right, but the right has moved closer to the center in that after Sharon, you have an understanding and a kind of acknowledgement or an acceptance that the project of Eretz Yisrael, that you would fill the West Bank and you would make up for the demographic problem by, the influx of immigrants from the former Soviet Union and later an influx of immigrants from other areas, which was the sort of founding idea of the entire settler movement, is no longer has any currency in the center, and the settlers are more vulnerable today than they were 10 years ago. So, I mean, I guess I'd say, it's just, I don't understand why you wouldn't include all of that recent history So it came off as a very one-sided history of Israeli politics and kind of bereft of context.
All right. Well, there's a lot there. So let me try to go through some of it. Yes, of course, people can change their mind. Benjamin Netanyahu, as you know, is spent his whole life essentially deeply steeped in the revisionist tradition. His father was an aide to Zev Jabotinsky, and if he had made a real intellectual moral break, as others have, like Tzipi Livni, Yitzhak Rabin, I would be the first to stand up and cheer. Sadly, I see no evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, let's go and look at his recent behavior. In the 2009 campaign, he ran against the idea of a Palestinian state. He still remained opposed to a Palestinian state when forming his government, which was very important because had he been willing to break and say he supported one, I think it would have been easier to get Tzipi Livni and Kadima into his coalition and not have such a right-wing coalition. Then, under intense pressure from the Obama administration, he came out, he gave this speech at Bar-Ilan University where he did utter the words Palestinian state. But if you look at the commentary of Israelis who genuinely are for a Palestinian state, if you look at what Tzipi Livni said about it, which we said basically was a sham, or you look at Ben Caspit of Mariv, who said basically these were, one of Israel's 2 or 3 most prominent columnists, who said basically these were poison pills that Netanyahu injected precisely because he knew it would make it impossible for the Palestinians to actually act in response. I mean, there are 2 poison pills in particular. The first is the demand that the Palestinians not just accept Israel, but accept Israel as a Jewish state. Totally unnecessary, I think, and something that would be very, very difficult, if not impossible for them to do, given that most Arab Israelis, and for somewhat understandable reasons, even though they feel Israeli, would in fact rather Israel not be a Jewish state since they're not Jews. Secondly, his claim that Jerusalem has to remain united under Israeli sovereignty, which actually flies in the face of the kind of deal that Barak offered, that any reasonable person would have to accept as the only kind of deal you're going to get, which is some Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem. So I can go and I can talk about this. We can talk about the settlement freeze too, which I think is absolutely a sham. We can talk about Sharon if you want to talk about Sharon, but I don't want to keep these. I don't want to keep these answers, make these answers too long. So why don't I just stop on that point about?
Well, let me respond. Let me respond to that. In the Likud primary in 2000, Ariel Sharon ran against Netanyahu because he said Netanyahu had accepted, and his prior government had accepted, a 2-state solution. And Netanyahu, before he becomes prime minister in 1998, argues that Likud is sort of accepting the notion of the peace process and a 2-state solution, but he stresses the notion of reciprocity. And under Netanyahu's first premiership, he signs the Y River Accord, which of course envisions a 2-state solution.
Well,
so Peter, wait a second. Let's get real here, okay? Israeli prime ministers say certain things when they're running for office. Israeli prime ministers say one thing, and when they govern, they say something else. And for you to sort of take a very tendentious view that Netanyahu really doesn't mean it this time, but he means it this time, and you only like the politicians that you like is picking and choosing. You can't pick the facts
Eli.
On this,
the problem is, for the sake of this conversation, I think you have to be a little bit briefer, so I have a chance actually to respond to the points. Okay, I don't want to interrupt you, but let me respond to the points. Okay, let's look at what Netanyahu has actually done. Right? I mean, he refused to implement Oslo. He demanded that Oslo be renegotiated after he was elected in 1996. As Dennis Ross, who writes extensively about the whole Netanyahu prime ministership in his book, and I think you would agree, is not a left-wing extremist, basically says that everybody in the Clinton administration, Berger, Albright, Clinton himself, believed that Netanyahu had no interest whatsoever in negotiating a Palestinian state. Netanyahu did finally sign the Y River, which was a significant kind of, in many ways, kind of pullback from what Oslo was supposed to do in terms of the second withdrawal of territory. But then let's look what he did there. He made no serious effort, really, to get it through his own government. In some ways, it's quite analogous to the situation today. The only way he was really going to get Y implemented would have been to shift his coalition away from a far-right coalition and make it a more centrist one. He refused to do that. He stalled in even bringing to the cabinet. He allowed the cabinet to instead of voting it for once in support of it, to have to vote repeatedly on every different measure, which made it much more difficult that it was going to get it through. And then his government collapsed. So I really see, if you're telling me that under extreme pressure, Bibi Netanyahu will take tactical kind of maneuvers to try to keep the Americans off his back, that's true. But in terms of doing anything serious that would actually move towards bringing towards a Palestinian state, I don't see it at all.
First of all, if you're arguing in this sort of hypothetical, would Bibi at this moment negotiate a peace agreement? Who knows? The Palestinians are deeply divided politically right now, and I think that Bibi, like almost every other Israeli, doesn't think that there is an immediate chance that you're going to have a final status negotiation. One piece of evidence for that is that the Palestinians have backed off on their longstanding policy of direct talks with the Israeli government and are now demanding proximity talks. So these are gambits. And as for your other point about the poison pill of recognizing it as a Jewish state, it's a negotiating gambit. That was Tzipi Livni's position at the beginning of the Annapolis negotiations process. And for you to say that the thing is a sort of poison pill that forecloses any option, I don't think you understand the difference between when you actually have a negotiation and that you make kind of concessions and you build up positions. There's a whole art to this. And then like your contention that somehow Bibi is committed to a politics of a greater Israel, which is just not true. There is no center constituency in Israel. There is no one in the national security establishment in Israel. And there's really no one in the Likud party right now, at least in the leadership of Israel, that wants or believes that they're going to continue this dream that started in the late 1970s with the original Likud government of Menachem Begin, and probably you'd have to say ended in 2005 when Arik Sharon unilaterally withdrew and was dismantled these settlements.
Eli, I really wish that were true. In reality, what we've seen is the number of settlers on the West Bank has gone from 200 to 300,000, with another 200,000 in East Jerusalem. And if Benjamin Netanyahu were in fact so committed to the idea of a Palestinian state ever, then you explain to me why, in fact, he publicly refused to take that position while he ran for prime minister and when he was negotiating a government, and only did it under enormous pressure from Barack Obama, and then in a very, very, very backhanded way in that Bar-Ilan speech.
Listen, I don't think, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily backhanded. Second of all, Bibi Netanyahu, and as we talked about, we can go round and round on this, but Israeli politics have changed. It's changed in the following sense. On the one hand, you're correct. Israelis are very doubtful that the Palestinians are going to be viable partners for peace. So you saw a lot of politicians, including Ehud Barak, running and positioning themselves as very differently than they did in the heyday of the peace process in the 1990s. On the other hand, Israelis accept there is no way that they can indefinitely occupy a demographic majority of Palestinians. And finally, I want to talk about your contention about 200 to 300,000 settlers, because I think it's a bit misleading. One of the things that I don't think you acknowledge in your essay is that there is a huge difference between the kinds of settlement activities that we saw up and through the 90s, which was creating new settlements, having a policy of punishing Palestinians by destroying their homes, destroying new Palestinian homes for the expansion of the perimeter of these settlements. And then what you're seeing now, which is there is a marketplace in the settlements known as Ma'ale Adumim, the Jerusalem metropolitan area, where, yes, that is widely accepted in the Taba agreements. It's going to remain in Israel. It's Jewish majority area. Some of these neighborhoods go back before 1967, before 1948. They were Jewish neighborhoods, and then the demography was changed between 48 and 1967. And these kinds of territories are not the same as the real problematic ones that I think that the vast majority of Israelis and the vast majority of people who care about Israel in this country and other folks would say are a problem and eventually are not going to be part of Israel. The settlements inside the center of Hebron and these other kind of places with outposts and I don't think you distinguish between these two kinds of things.
No, look.
In a sense, it sort of it feeds to your argument. So
okay, look. Obviously, there are there are different kinds of settlements and different kinds of settlers, and some of the settlements are going to probably remain in Israel. Although it's important to remember that basically the Palestinians have never ever given up on the idea of a one-for-one return, and the more of those settlements Israel keeps, probably the more ultimately of its own land is going to have to give up in the Negev or whatever. But of course there are differences in settlements. But the question is, that you still have, you've got a quarter, according to Akiva Eldar and Edith Zertal, who's, I think, book Lords of the Land is really the authoritative tome on this, basically who are not people who just were bribed by basically subsidies and commute to Jerusalem, but are really Gush Emunim types. And you have a settlement process that not only has a number of settlers all over the West Bank has not only gone up by about a third between 2000, but is continuing today. I mean, I think it's really important that we not take the Netanyahu government at face value on the settlement freeze. I mean, Yisrael Katz, is Netanyahu's own transportation minister, just said in March, he was quoted in Maariv as saying this, let me quote you, "The construction momentum in Judea and Samaria is the same as when it was at its peak." And that's because, as Yediot reported last December, there was a huge amount of construction that was built, that was created just before they announced the settlement freeze. That construction is now going forward. And, and as Netanyahu has said, no, I didn't interrupt you, Eli. And as the settlement, and as Netanyahu and Lieberman have both said, the settlement freeze is not going to be extended after September. In fact, this Israeli government is actually going about trying to legalize certain Israeli illegal outposts. So this good news story that you're telling me about the fact that Netanyahu is committed to the idea of a Palestinian state. I don't think he is. I don't think Sharon was, for that matter, at all. I think there's no evidence that Sharon was. And on the ground, it's becoming...
That's crazy talk. That's nonsense.
Okay, well, let me explain to you. Because when Netanyahu, there were less than 10,000 settlers in Gaza, right? When they were removed, which I think was to the good, Netanyahu's own chief advisor, Doug Weissglass, said basically that part of the reason for doing this was to put the peace process in formaldehyde, so that there would be no peace process. So Sharon wanted a long-term interim agreement which would keep Israel in control of the vast majority of the West Bank. As Akiva Eldar and others have reported, he himself used the word Bantustans in explaining his long-term vision for what Palestine would be like, a whole series of unrelated cantons. There was no fundamental transformation with Ariel Sharon of the kind you're describing. Most of those 10,000 settlers in Gaza actually moved to the West Bank, and the larger context is that the number of settlers between 2000 and 2010 has increased 100,000. So this good news story you're telling me, I so much wish it were true, but I just don't see it.
Okay, I don't think you understand how to read Israeli politics, because you're
referring to... Okay, so please explain it to me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm saying Dubi Weissglass's interview referring to this line about formaldehyde was done at a time when it was unclear whether or not how much of Likud was eventually going to be in a separate party called Kadima. So he was trying, this is an example of internal Likud politics, and you want to pick and choose one interview. Why didn't you quote Ariel Sharon's actual speeches at the Herzliya conference or later to the Knesset, where he's explaining how disengagement program would not foreclose a two-state solution. Indeed, it's an interim step to make sure that Israel has more secure borders until the final phase of the implementation of the roadmap. The context of Dubi Weissglass's speech was really about the Palestinian Authority not getting a concession from Israel until they dealt with the terror problem, which was sort of winding its way down by 2004, 2005. And there was still a very loud voice within Likud that said, give the Arabs nothing until they control terrorism. And it was all about the sequence. So, I mean, I think that that's the way you have to see it. Today, Dubi Weissglass, I'm sure if you called him up, would say that Ariel Sharon understood the inevitability of the fact that that Israel was not going to keep most of that land that is held, that Israel won in 1967. And I want to make another point, which I want to make one more point that I think you really gloss over. And that is, until 2005, the only time that Israel had ever dismantled a settlement was in 1978 or 9, after the agreement to give back the Sinai to the Egyptians in the original Camp David Accord. There was a pregnant question throughout the entire peace process, Peter. Will it be possible for the IDF to take on angry settlers? And this confrontation built for a year in Israel. They lined the highways. They protested for an entire year. And Ariel Sharon did it. He also, by the way, dismantled 4 settlements in the northern West Bank. Granted, not the biggest settlements in the world, but to prove the point that the Israeli army could, in fact, take on the fringe of the settler movement that was going to lay down their bodies, really, to try to stop this. So Israel went through an incredibly traumatic process, and for you to sort of dismiss this as Ariel Sharon, and it sounds to me, honestly, like you you like Meretz, you like labor, and everybody who is not on the right side of the political, you're gonna sort of take whatever evidence you can find. Whatever evidence you can find, and you're going to try to make them into some sort of monster.
Look, Eli. There are people who've been on the right side of the process who like Tzipi Livni, even Yitzhak Rabin, who although he was in labor was hardly a dove, who made I think really fundamental transformations, and I applaud them. I would hope for nothing more than to have more Israeli politicians of that Nixon in China variety. But I just simply see no evidence either with Netanyahu or Sharon as much as I would like to. I mean, it is important to remember with both of these guys how deeply, deeply committed and entangled their entire careers are with the deep opposition to a Palestinian state, and particularly in Sharon's case, of course, with a really, really deep connection to the idea that that Israel has a right to settle most of the West Bank, and that in fact it's necessary for Israeli security. You're suggesting. Do you know when was
the last time Israel built a new settlement out in the West Bank? I mean, it depends on, I guess, how you define it. But we're talking about a block of settlements in the metropolitan area of Jerusalem. That's where the settlement activity is. The other stuff that you're talking about is not happening anymore.
They're very large blocks of settlements which go all the way right into the middle, halfway through into the West Bank. In terms of building new land for settlements, I mean, Yesh Din just reported that they've seized Palestinian land for extending Ofra as recently as December of last year. So, again, Netanyahu's own government says the construction in settlements is going on at the highest rate it's ever gone on. This is also what the Israeli human rights groups. But let me just go back to Sharon, because I feel like we keep bouncing around. I just want to go back to this point a little bit. It seems to me, in fact, entirely consistent with the way Sharon has acted, that he would be interested in basically getting rid of, again, under 10,000 settlers in Gaza, at the same time that basically he tries to entrench the vast majority of settlements, including settlements deep into the West Bank. I don't see, and the fact that the Israelis who are most committed to the idea of a Palestinian state generally tend to take that view. I think, let me read the whole Weissglass quote, because you said I took it out of context, but let me read the whole thing. You can tell me where you think it's out of context. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. When you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Disengagement supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. I think that's genuinely what Ariel Sharon believed, and I fail to see the evidence.
Except Ariel Sharon never said that. Except he never said it. In fact, what he said was, I'm going to withdraw from Gaza, and in the interim, I'm going to have more defensible borders. But this is not precluding. It's not precluding what he said the whole time was the roadmap. And the context of that at the time is a political fight within the Likud party. That you had a prime minister who was willing to break up his own ruling coalition in order to finally dismantle settlements and actually do something instead of talk about it. And you quote something which I think that interview was given at the time to try to placate and win as many members of Likud over to the new Kadima coalition as possible. And it's not I think I would like to go on what Ariel Sharon actually said. Over and over again. I'm doing this because I understand that we need defensible borders for Israel. We can't continue to occupy all this territory. The dream is over, and on and on and on.
When you say that, what are these defensible borders that you're talking about, and how long is this interim period? The interim period you're talking about was in Sharon's mind a decades-long period. You also haven't responded to my to what. Because, in fact, he said that, and that is, I don't have the quote in front of you, but that was clearly his idea about he wanted basically, again, formaldehyde. They wanted a long-term process, basically, in which the Palestinians basically were locked in this position with Israel controlling the large majority of the West Bank. And, as I said, it was reported in Haaretz and elsewhere that Sharon, at various points, this is not back in the 1970s, but this is at exactly the same time, was expressing basically sketched out this vision to people of many, many, many small Palestinian cantons based on... Go ahead.
Peter, if you're correct, which I'm totally sure you're not, but if you are correct, then why is it that Ariel Sharon agrees to not expand the perimeter of existing settlements on the West Bank, agrees to end pretty much all federal subsidies to settlers, and agrees
He ended federal subsidies for settlers?
Yes, he did. He ended the subsidization and the secret agreements with Bush. Yes, he did. There were a series of these agreements.
That is absolutely not the case. The subsidies, the housing subsidies, the agricultural, the industrial subsidies have not been stopped at all. I mean, the sewage lines, the bus routes, the army protection. All right.
Well, if you're going to include the IDF and the bus protection, but keep in mind also the IDF West Bank.
Why have the settlements? Why have the settlements increased so much?
So to summarize, the Peter Beinart position is. What he dismantled some settlements, but he didn't dismantle all of the settlements. Is that your position?
No. The Peter Beinart position is that while I'm glad that Israel got rid of settlements from Gaza, I think what Ariel Sharon was trying to do was to put Israel in a position where it could relieve some of the international pressure and get rid of some of the headache in Gaza, so it could basically squat in the vast majority of the West Bank for decades and decades to come, which I think is actually a much more consistent story with the whole long arc of Ariel Sharon's career than your suggestion of a radical, dramatic shift from a guy who all of a sudden wants to give back the vast majority of the West Bank.
Okay, and let me then reiterate, and then we can close this. I'm basing my position on what Ariel Sharon said at the time, which was we're going to withdraw from Gaza to more defensible borders. This will remove any excuses. He said this will this will remove any excuses from the Palestinian to continue to support terrorism. And when they stop supporting terrorism, we can move on with the roadmap. And the roadmap has a process, the third phase, which is the negotiation of a two-state solution. So
and the roadmap also says no settlement growth, which continues under Ariel Sharon.
Vast amounts of words from Ariel Sharon, not to mention American, European leaders, the quartet, and everybody else, undercuts, your quote from Doobie Weissglass, which I think it's a radical misinterpretation. And we're not going to. We're clearly not going to disagree.
I'll just end that. It happens to be the interpretation of Sharon's career that I think you would find is widely held amongst those Israelis who actually are passionately in support of a Palestinian state. I think the defensible borders that you're essentially talking about in Sharon's plan are basically borders that include it's nothing like what Barak offered at Taba, but basically the vast majority of settlements in the West Bank, and basically an interim period of decades and decades with no political movement, and that's what I think Weissglass was saying.
Well, all right, we're going to agree to disagree. I think the fact that Sharon mentions the final phase of the roadmap puts us in the context of removing the final excuse for the Palestinians to support terror, which then gets him to the negotiating table, and not to mention like everybody else at the time who was involved in the diplomacy of it. And we don't know, by the way, about comparing this against Taba because there was no offer. But we do know that once we got back to Annapolis and once we got to the end of Ehud Olmert's tenure as prime minister, there was yet another offer to the Palestinians to share sovereignty of Jerusalem. This has been fairly consistent with Israeli governments that when it comes down to it, when these Palestinians are ready, this is what this is going to look like. I guess what I'm saying is that if you don't have the expansion of the creation of new settlements in the area, and all you do is mainly settlement activity in Ma'ale Adumim, then what is... And also, by the way, you're ignoring the fact that everybody has agreed that Netanyahu has removed a lot of roadblocks in the West Bank. He was just joined into the OECD, and that he's focused what he calls an economic peace plan. So it's not like Netanyahu has done absolutely nothing. He's approached it in his own way. And then after pressure, you're right, there was pressure from Obama, embrace a two-state solution and do this temporary freeze, which, by the way, you don't like that freeze, but George Mitchell, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama all seem to think that is a significant step, and they've described it as at least the most far-reaching concession on settlements from any prime minister. You want to debate about that, that's fine, but your debate is with the people in the middle of the peace process right now for the U.S. side.
Oh, okay, Eli. One of the things that makes this a little bit difficult is you keep moving around to so many different topics. That it's a little bit difficult for me to respond to them all. Let me start with this point about the settlement freeze. You're right. I don't agree with what the Obama administration publicly said about Obama. I'm much more interested in taking actually the views of the Israelis who actually track settlement growth. And in fact, I think also more credible is Netanyahu's own transportation minister, who said basically construction is going on at the same peak it was before. When you're right, it's good that they've taken down some roadblocks in the West Bank. I think that is great, but I don't think you'll ever read a single story about the economic growth that's taken place in certain parts of the West Bank, without Palestinians complaining bitterly about how hard the settlements still make economic life in the West Bank, and the fact that Netanyahu is actually now trying to legalize certain illegal outposts. They're not removing illegal outposts at all. In fact, they're going out of their way to try to legalize some of them, I think, is particularly pernicious. On the Olmert question, I give Olmert all the credit in the world for finally coming around to the position that, in fact, there should be a Palestinian state and that it should include, in fact, East Jerusalem, which is the position that Netanyahu himself ruled out at that Bar-Ilan speech when he said there would be no Palestine, when he said all of Jerusalem would have to remain under Israeli sovereignty. But I think it's also important to look at the conditions under which Olmert made that proposal. I mean, it's funny you said the Taba wasn't a real proposal, because what Olmert made was not in that sense a real proposal either. It was never written down. It was never consulted with his cabinet. It was a verbal offer by a guy who was already a lame duck, who had already basically said he was going to step down. So while I really applaud Ehud Olmert for finally coming to the view that there should be a Palestinian state with some sovereignty over East Jerusalem, I think it would have been crazy to imagine that, in fact, at that stage in his prime ministership, you really would have been able to get a deal done.
All right, well, let's move on to something, because in subsequent pieces and back and forth on this stuff, you have embraced, I guess, the view that the U.S. should talk to Hamas. Is that right? Or the U.S. should encourage a unity government? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Describe your position. I
think at least I would say that I think the U.S. Should have been supportive of a Palestinian unity government, and that we could have taken the same position we do with the Hezbollah ministers in the Lebanese government, which is we deal with the Lebanese non-Hezbollah ministers, and we don't deal with the Hezbollah ones. Yeah.
And is that still your position?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've also written that you think that Salam Fayyad, and you get no argument from me, Salam Fayyad seems like a true reformer, and Abu Mazen represent like the best Palestinian leaders to date to cut a deal. But don't you think that in advocating a policy that would support their rivals, who only 2 years ago were throwing Fatah security guys off of buildings, albeit probably provoked and such, but is undermining the best chance for a peace leader from the Palestinians in your view?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I think that the Palestinian Unity Government would very likely, I mean, if you look at the Mecca Agreement, would have kept Abbas as prime minister to allow that negotiating process to take place. Maybe it would have limited Abbas and Fayyad in certain ways, but it also would have meant that you had a unified Palestinian national movement, which I think is really the key to ultimately being able to get a deal. I think it is really very, very hard to imagine that you can basically have war with Gaza and really significant movement with the West Bank. So I think ultimately it was very important to have a unified Palestinian national movement. I mean, it's important that I think that you acknowledge that what happened in Gaza, the fighting between Hamas and Fatah was really provoked. I think that the U.S., in particular the Bush administration, really deserves a lot of blame for basically not only opposing bringing the two parties together, which I think is really what Hamas wanted, at least for tactical reasons, and in fact encouraging Fatah to try to take power violently in Gaza, which led to them getting their asses kicked, to put it colloquially. I think that there were a whole series of blunders made, and I take that from the position of looking at the Gaza war. I mean, I recognize that in any kind of war, horrible things are going to take place. But I think that's why it's particularly important to ask the question of whether this was a last resort and whether people exhausted political opportunities to try to prevent this showdown from taking place. And I think these were some of the political opportunities that could have been seized after Hamas won an election that, let's remember, the Bush administration, in fact, demanded that the Palestinians hold as part of their democracy push in the Middle East.
Wow, Peter, I mean, as a guy who cares about human rights and liberalism, don't you see the risk of having the West effectively, indirectly, albeit, but effectively recognizing that Hamas, it's okay for an organization like Hamas that, encourages children to become suicide bombers and, the whole rest who really are interested in kind of creating a Sharia state. It strikes me that it's making a very similar mistake to what was done by empowering Arafat in a way during the peace process, a guy who used his power dictatorially against Palestinians. And in many ways, if you want to get back to sort of the provocation, it goes back a long way. But the human rights violations under Oslo, because there was a support for Arafat, and you want to do the same thing to Hamas, which is getting a lot of its money from Iran and represents an ideology which is not just the elimination of the Jewish state, but I think the elimination in the end of the day of Palestine. It just strikes me as, it just strikes me as extremely cruel policy that puts you in the camp of Daniel Levy and the New America Foundation, Steve Clemens, and all these folks who just sort of are rushing to kind of recognize Hamas, where I think that there is a real danger there. It doesn't recognize Palestinian politics themselves are in play, and the card of recognition, especially from the United States and the West, is a very valuable card. And I don't know. I mean, it strikes me as a kind of, at the end of the day, a real morally vacuous policy.
Well, look,
and a problematic one. Yeah.
I mean, I detest Hamas. I detest.
I know you do. I know, and you've made that. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I want to be clear about that. But I actually think, and I think the question of the degree to which the U.S. recognized Hamas, I think could have been to some degree handled by this way we deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon. But I actually, you know, look, when you're dealing with an organization like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or whoever, there's always a risk. But the fundamental difference, I think, between the policy, I mean, of course, the whole irony of this is, right, is this was partly the Bush administration, which was basically taking the view, I think ultimately really the right view, that basically you're better off trying to have a political process in which you have free elections and you bring a movement, even an odious movement like Hamas, into a government. You know, I think you would have had to have Hamas change to some degree, like, you know, being part of a government that endorsed the Arab League 2002 plan, for instance, which would have been a kind of a backhanded way of accepting Israel's existence. And I think you would have obviously had to have some kind of willingness to have a ceasefire and to not take violent action, which Hamas, in fact, even on its own, did at various points between its election and the late 2008 Gaza war. But I think that would have been a much better solution than the one we've had today. I mean, how morally is it profiting the Palestinians today to be ruled entirely by Hamas in Gaza without any national unity government that could provide some trace of liberalism, and then in a embargo situation where 80% of the population is on food aid? It seems to me what we have now is a real moral nightmare, and I don't think this was the best possible scenario to play itself out.
Well, I guess, I mean, listen, if you want to argue that the Israelis and the Egyptians and their enforcement of embargoes in the border should allow in pasta and macaroni, you don't get an argument from me. However, I would really point out here that it's pretty, I mean, Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad, the good guys, have really urged, don't deal with Hamas. They're not interested in peace. They're not interested in coexistence with either us or Israel. And they've said this loud and clear privately and publicly. And it's very telling. I mean, listen, you want to go, we can talk about Gaza at the end of this, but, you know, during the Gaza offensive at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, you will search for a quote from Mahmoud Abbas and you won't find one condemning it. So it seems to me that it's like you're almost prejudging like an important question in Palestinian politics. Then finally, I would say there is a difference between Ikhwan or Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or even the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq, which are parties committed to a political process because they don't arm themselves. And then Hamas, and Hezbollah for that matter, which are committed to both the political process when it works for them, but also the terrorism process when it doesn't work for them, and the armed struggle process when it doesn't work for them. And you run into a lot of problems. I think I agree with you about you have to a degree, accept that there's going to be parties that embrace an Islamic politics or political Islam in future democracies in the Middle East. But you really have to be very clear that you don't want to accept parties that are also dangerous militias that bully their political opposition. And evidence of their bullying, Peter, as you know and I do, is that Hamas has been delaying. They don't want another election, probably because they would lose. So what I don't understand is why you, and not so much you, because you're not been out in front of this, but why the New America Foundation and George Soros and others, you know, who push this line aren't doing the opposite. Why aren't they saying, I want a free and fair election for the Palestinians, and I want to try to support whoever's running against Hamas?
Well, But Eli, I mean, it's hard to say you support a free and fair election for the Palestinians if you basically say that you're then going to not recognize the result of those elections when Hamas wins. I mean, the Bush administration's kind of whole democracy push in a way was so badly undermined by the blatant hypocrisy of that. I agree with you absolutely that the goal has got to be for Hamas to be a political party, maybe a political party with views that I very much dislike, but a political party and not a militia. It's difficult to do that in a context when you don't even have a Palestinian state, but I think the best analogy would be something like what happened with the IRA. It was a long process, basically, of gradually trying to wean the IRA, also a very nasty bunch of guys, away, more and more away from military action and more away towards political action by trying to invest them in the political process and make it harder and harder for them to basically to defect from it. I think so. You can agree that ultimately the goal absolutely has to be, one gun one kind of sovereignty in the Palestinian territories, which has control of force of arms, but believe that in fact that it was unrealistic to expect that you were going to get there with Hamas right away, and that in fact you needed a process to get there. In fact, I think what we've done instead is really not force Hamas to actually have to try to be held accountable by being in various cabinet ministries in a larger government headed by a boss, which itself would be committed to a ceasefire and at least in a certain kind of way accept Israel's right to exist, and then see how they perform. I think that would have been a much better result than the result we've seen, which has been so tragic for both Gazans and Israelis in the last few years. You're right that there's some people in Fatah who were very happy for basically us to try to crush Hamas, but I think we saw the folly of that position when we basically reportedly, kind of encouraged Ahlan to try to take power in Gaza, and it backfired.
Well, I'm not going to, get into the relationship with Ahlan, but just to go back to your IRA analogy, Peter, I think that it's more like when the IRA split with the real IRA, and there were still these, irredentists in the Irish nationals, they were still terrorists, basically, and then there was the vast majority, like Jerry Adams, or political wing that had accepted and sort of gradually moderated. But we sort of have been through that process with the PLO to a degree. I guess I would just point out that that Hamas were the rejectionists during the peace process, and that this was supposed to be, that we were supposed to sort of, you're always going to have these rejectionists. Do you know what I'm saying? And now the
Sure.
rejectionists are the new IRA, and you sort of, so I find that view is somewhat problematic. And I think including Hamas, I think the other thing I would say is this. I think that it was wrong to allow Hamas to participate politically while they were still an armed militia and still devoted to terrorism. So, and I think that that's a consistent position with the Bush democracy agenda too. But But
you would have allowed Fatah to run.
Well, I'm saying that, Fatah though the preventive security services were part of the state that was being built up. They were like, I guess you could say, legitimate guns. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to illegitimate guns. But the I would say is akin to sort of the push to try to include Hamas in a unity government was like the failed efforts to include Muqtada al-Sadr in the Iraqi governments. It's a good thing that Sadr was eventually excised from the Maliki government, because that gave Maliki the political space and ultimately legitimacy with other Sunni Iraqis to take on the irredentist terrorists on the Shia side who liked Sadr's minions, or elements of Sadr's minions, I suppose, that were terrorizing regular Iraqis. And so I think that I just think that that's a dangerous position to be in, where you favor this kind of unity government with people who seem to have interest only in unity on their very narrow terms.
Well, I guess I would just say that I think that there were a bunch of statements from Hamas leaders basically suggesting that they would have been open to various things like a long-term ceasefire. I agree. I don't think that would be true for all of Hamas, but I think that it was essentially only by giving Hamas more of an opportunity to participate in the political process that I think you potentially have the split kind of within the Palestinian rejectionist camp that leads to the true rejectionists being more marginalized, and that others in Hamas actually becoming more invested in the political process. Can we guarantee that would have worked? No, we can't guarantee that would have worked. But again, I think that when you look back at it from the perspective of what happened in the Gaza war and how terrible this path has turned out for both the people of Gaza and the people of Sderot, I think at least have to ask, could more have an effort been made, in fact, to find a way of dealing with this Hamas problem? And I agree it's a problem politically rather than militarily. I think there was at the very least a real lack of creativity on both the Israeli and the American side.
Okay. Well, that's a good place to leave it. And we have in our last third of the dialogue here an opportunity to talk about really what finally is the central thesis of your essay, which is the failure, in your view, of the Jewish institutions. And why don't you talk about that? That seems to me sort of restate the thesis, and then let's just get into that.
Well, I think there are some differences between the different communal Jewish organizations, but by and large, they tend to avoid public criticism of the Israeli government. And I think that kind of publicly uncritical Zionism does not accord with the values of most, particularly younger secular American Jews, given their own experience. And I think it's part of the reason, not the only reason, but I think it's one reason that you're seeing such a kind of collapse in Zionism amongst younger secular Jews who are the large majority. And so I think what I would like is for the Jewish organizations like AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations to take their own rhetoric more seriously about how they say that they admire Israel not only because it's a Jewish state, but because it's a liberal, democratic Jewish state that respects human rights and free speech and desires peace and is open to territorial withdrawal. And I think if they really believe that, then they should ally themselves with those people in Israel who genuinely hold those values and be willing to be publicly critical of those, even those in the government who don't.
Well, I think there are a couple problems with that. One is that it's, the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, AIPAC, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress. These are membership-based organizations. They're totally voluntary, and they're, at least I checked this with AIPAC before I did this, but AIPAC claims its membership and in every respect is going through the roof. So I think that there's an interesting thing I wanted to kind of point out, which is that you can take an opinion poll of young American Jews, but really there's a small minority, a slice of that broader pictures. 5 million Jews in the United States. There's 100,000 official members of AIPAC, and if you add up all the other groups, it's maybe more. So you're talking about a percentage of a percentage, and these are the people who are going to be politically active. Now, certainly there is a kind of, for lack of a better word, neo-progressive group in general that has been more critical of Israel, and there are a lot of Jews who find themselves politically in that camp. And, it's good now that there are organizations, as there kind of always have been, Peter, for more, progressive, neo-progressive Jews. In this case, it would be J Street for this generation, but there was the Israel Policy Forum, there was Grey Ra. There have always been these sort of more, and there's just as there for more conservative Zionists and Jews, there's the Zionist Organization of America. And those groups will criticize Israeli governments when they don't hew politically to kind of where they want to be. AIPAC in particular is really there to support the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I think it does a lot more almost behind the scenes in the maintenance of that relationship both ways. It's a portal to both governments. For example, in the 1990s, in the last decade, there was a tremendous amount of concern and frustration from the U.S. defense establishment that its partner in the defense industries in Israel were also selling sensitive radar plane known as the Falcon to the Chinese and the People's Liberation Army there. And so their AIPAC, I know this for a fact, played a small but important behind-the-scenes role of telling the Israelis that they really needed to cut this sort of thing out. And in exchange, in the past, of course, AIPAC has delivered discrete messages to the U.S. side of things. And there's a series of things that AIPAC does. So I guess it just, in that sense, I don't think it's AIPAC's job. AIPAC's job is to support. And when there were peace process governments, by the way, in Israel, you had none other than Steve Rosen going to the Heritage Foundation in 1993 with every conservative group in town and saying, listen, we're going to go for a peace process. I know that we haven't done that before, but this is the new way it's going to be. And AIPAC was criticized from the right in the 1990s of failing to account for, the delicate sensibilities of conservatives in this process. So I think that it's just in AIPAC's case, it's
Okay.
really not their job.
Okay. Well, let me just respond to that to that point. You're absolutely right that AIPAC's public position is they don't criticize the Israeli government, publicly criticize any Israeli government. As I said, I disagree with that. I think that violates AIPAC's own stated principles about what it admires in Israel. I also think that the history of the 1990s shows, in fact, that AIPAC, although it publicly supported Rabin during the peace process, Rabin, as you know, was absolutely furious because he believed that AIPAC was going behind his back and encouraging Congress to do things that pass resolutions that would, in fact, make it much more difficult for him to continue the peace process, and that's why he helped to create Israel Policy Forum. So although AIPAC publicly was supportive of the peace process, powerful AIPAC board members were actually walking the halls of Congress. This has been described, I think, in J.J. Goldberg's book, Jewish Power, and other places, basically in opposition to the Rabin government and the peace process. So, AIPAC, it's not that I don't think that a group like AIPAC can survive. What I was suggesting is that if you look at where I think they're going to get most of their members in the coming generations, I think it's going to be a group that has a larger and larger percent of Orthodox Jews in it. And that's because Orthodox Jews tend to be, in the younger generation, much more committed to Israel, but also much less liberal in their vision of Israel. And I think my prediction, it's just a prediction, but that is actually going to mean that AIPAC's willingness to criticize Israeli governments from the right, its identity as more of a right-wing organization, is going to increase in the coming years. I mean, already Rabin was furious at the way it handled itself in the 1990s under the peace process. I'm afraid that AIPAC, in fact, is going to become more like the ZOA in the coming years.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. I think that it's a very different organization than ZOA, and it's possible that there'll be more of a kind of fractalization. But I want to kind of get to something else, which is about this notion, and I see it, kind of, if you read Spencer Ackerman's blog, he sometimes does this annoying thing where he addresses the left side of the shtetl and the right side of the shtetl. And, I mean, here's my view. It's interesting that you have a few bloggers who have become interested in recent years about Israel, and a few people like Jeremy Ben-Ami and other people that kind of come from the, but it's really like the kind of intellectual history of this stuff I just think it's like, it's not particularly within the realms of Zionism, to be perfectly real talk right here, Peter. You have, a kind of net left movement or neo-progressive movement in this country coming up during Bush that believed at first that the Israel lobby had, helped manipulate intelligence to force America to launch the Iraq War. And I know you're not saying that, you didn't get into that, but that is a very prevalent view of, In fact,
I wrote an entire column saying that I think actually, that the fact that the same group people supported. I don't believe that. I've actually written publicly about that.
I that's why I said I'm not ascribing it to you. Okay, but you have this kind of, you have an interest in the Israel lobby on what might be, for lack of a better word, the net left, okay, the internet bloggers, and they say all kinds of stuff about it, and they like to puff up their chests and say that, listen, I'm against it and so forth. But I wonder if that translates into building a real organization with real Americans, most of them Jewish, coming to Washington, who are activists, who follow these issues, and that is what AIPAC currently has. And I wonder that if AIPAC was to take the sensibilities of a Matthew Iglesias more seriously, which it doesn't right now, if it would, is there like some membership that it would be attracting? Would it make it? I mean, I just wonder like why it should listen to that. I mean, like who, it seems to me at least that Matthew Iglesias and a lot of the people on the net left are beyond simply saying we're liberal Zionists. They're hostile in a lot of ways to Israel. They tend to never give Israel the benefit of the doubt. They tend to exaggerate Israel's flaws and faults, and they tend to ignore other factors in the Palestinians, and it's part of a sort of narrative to defame and delegitimize Israel that it's just, in my estimation, it doesn't really hew to reality, and it's not so much a reflection of liberal or conservative Zionism as much as it is almost post-Zionism.
Well, there's a lot you said there. Let me.
Okay.
I've gone to speak at. I used to give speeches for AIPAC, so I've probably gone to dozens of AIPAC chapters. And what you tend to find across the country, what you tend to find is that the people who go to these events are kind of pillar of the community types. The same kind of people who go to federation dinners, or that kind of thing. They, as I said in my piece, I think they tend to be what I would call them Hubert Humphrey Democrats. They're kind of moderate Democrats by and large, liberal on a lot of stuff, but they kind of carve out an exception in a way. They're more hawkish on Israel than they are on almost anything else. I think that's a very particular identity that emerged at a moment in time, particularly by people, as I said in the piece, who were shaped in this extraordinary period starting before the 67 war and leading up through the Zionism equals racism resolution after the Yom Kippur War. I think what is striking is that that particular identity constellation, I think, is not really translating to these people's kids and grandkids. And I think you're right. There are intellectuals are always a small number compared to larger groups, but intellectuals also, they also have an influence on groups. And I think what's really striking to me is that if you look at prominent younger liberal bloggers, I can't think of a single one who is basically a liberal on most things but carves out an exception for Israel. They don't carve out an exception. This carving out an exception, I think what you're finding is the people who basically don't criticize Israel are also people who are more hawkish and to the right on other things as well. And given that I think American Jewry is likely to remain, in general, on the left for a long time, I think what you're going to find is those traditional members of AIPAC are going to basically, they're going to die off. And the question is, I think, what we should be doing is cultivating people. I mean, I think Jewish organizations should be cultivating people like Matthew Iglesias, who I think, in fact, basically take their cue, frankly, from the Israeli left, from the willingness of the Israeli left to be harshly critical.
Matthew Iglesias, 3 years ago, Peter, was writing that the Israel lobby was hyping the threat from Iran, and therefore we shouldn't listen. Matthew Iglesias defends Walt Mearsheimer and gets in this whole nonsense narrative about how the pro-Israel lobby muzzles critics of Israel. I mean, that's
wait. Eli, it's not going to do us any good for us to, if you want to debate Matthew Iglesias himself, that would be good. I think the Israel lobby does actually. I mean, I think they are clearly hostile to people who are harshly critical of Israel. I don't think that's any big shock. The question of how
they're going to get there for Israel, right?
Well, no, but I mean, the point is that I believe that you can be harshly critical of Israel and believe that that's in Israel's best interest. I mean, that's what I profoundly believe. I think that the point that what I was trying to make is, I think it's really striking that we are not finding any intellectual younger leaders who consider themselves liberals who basically take an AIPAC position, a kind of hear no evil, see no evil position on Israel. And I think that is really going to filter down. That is going to have a large effect on the larger group of younger American Jews. That kind of position that I was describing amongst the people who I saw in their 50s and 60s and 70s at AIPAC meetings, I really don't think it does exist very much in your 20s and 30s. And that's why I think what J Street is doing, the idea of trying to create a space in which you can be a Zionist. It's really important that you're going to be a Zionist, not that you're going to be indifferent and not that you're going to be for a binational state, but that you're going to be a Zionist and that you're going to be critical of Israel is so precious, because if that space is not nurtured, I think what we are going to have is just a mass move towards complete apathy. And also on the intellectual left, I think absolutely, if you're suggesting this, I think you're right. I think we are seeing a move towards more and more mainstream support for a binational state. And it's precisely because I'm opposed to a binational state that I think it's so important to try to build institutions of critical liberal Zionism. So we're not forced into a position where basically the debate becomes between a binational state on the one hand and between no public criticism of Victor Lieberman on the other.
Well, I mean, it's almost like I guess we sort of wrap up. I mean, we clearly are going to see things certainly differently. But I think the idea of Israel is something, I mean, to a degree, I suppose I agree with you in the following sense. If you think that Israel is a model of a democracy fighting against jihadist terrorist threat and figuring out a way to remain free despite these many challenges, which many people on the right believe, but almost no one on the left believes, then chances are you're going to be attracted to pro-Israel organizations. If, on the other hand, you believe that Israel is a boat anchor around American interests and that it's a U.S. support for Israel is endangering, our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that Israel, and you constantly get into what I think is a sort of narrative where you exaggerate Israel's shortcomings and you ignore the context and so forth, then yeah, chances are you're going to be attracted to another kind of organization. But I wonder, though, why are we playing word games about that? At a certain point, when does it stop being like, I'm part of the mishpacha and I'm really here because I love you so much, but I have to say this? Because, your view of, not even your view, but like the view of this sort of new neo-progressive left or whatever is, I just think, hostile to Israel. And it's nothing wrong with that. It's what,
sorry?
It's hostile to Israel. It's just
I just don't. Look, yeah. There are obviously people. Go ahead.
Well, it's hostile to Israel. As a journalist, it's perfectly fine. If you're hostile to Israel, join an organization that doesn't like Israel. And if you like Israel, and insofar as that's an indicator or a marker of your politics, forget for a second whether you're Jewish or not, but just a marker of your politics, that's just, how it is. A lot of Americans really like Israel because they have a value affinity with it. They think, I was just in India, Peter, okay? Hindu nationalists in India love Israel in part for all the reasons why you think it does. For all of the moral shortcomings that you don't like about Israel. So in some way,
okay. I think that what you're doing, which I think is unfortunate, is you're saying people are hostile to Israel when what they're hostile to is a certain set of Israeli policies and an Israeli government.
I just think it crosses the line into just.
Okay, well, look, we have to go. I'm willing to concede that there are people out there in the world, of course, who are simply hostile to the existence of the state of Israel and who would like Israel to basically not be a Jewish state, but to be a state of all of its citizens. Right? There are clearly people who have that position. They were, in fact, that was actually Martin Buber's position. It was Hannah Arendt's position. It was Henrietta Solt's, the founder of Hadassah's position. It's Noam Chomsky's position. There are lots of people who hold that position. It's not my position, and I think it's not actually the position of most of the prominent people in the liberal blogosphere. Most of those people in the liberal blogosphere, who I think are essentially take their moral cues from the people on the Israeli left, believe that the only way that Israel is encouraging various trends that threaten its future as a liberal democracy. What frustrates me about those people who say they love Israel because it's, as you said, a model democracy, if they care so much about Israeli democracy, why aren't they willing to fight for Israeli democracy against the anti-democratic trends that exist in Israel? It seems to me there is a struggle for Israeli democracy going on, just as I think to some degree there was a struggle to a lesser extent for American democracy during the Bush administration. And if people want to care so much about democracy, they should be involved in that struggle on behalf of people who don't want to disenfranchise and delegitimize and potentially expel Arab Israelis. People who do believe in the right to criticize the Israeli government.
I think that if you look at the grand arc of Israeli history, they had far fewer rights under the first 20 years of labor government than they did since then. But I guess I could turn the question around on you, Peter.
I think it's worse now. I think it's worse now.
I really do. You think it's worse now than 1965?
No.
You think it's worse now than 1965?
No, but I don't. But I do think it's worse now than it was in the 1980s and 90s. You did not have an Avigdor Lieberman position. The Mosawa Center, which focuses on... No, Eli, let me finish, because I really made an effort not to interrupt you. The Mosawa Center, which kind of works on Arab-Israeli questions, it's a joint Israeli-Arab-Jewish group, basically said there's never been a Knesset that has introduced as many pieces of anti-Arab legislation, some of which have gone through a first reading, as this one. So I sadly... And you're talking about the last 20 or 30 years in Israel, I don't see the positive art you're talking about. I see, in fact, a very disturbing negative one. Lieberman won the vote among Israeli high school students in the mock elections.
Okay, and I guess what I would say is that if someone who purports to care about Israeli democracy, I don't think you've really done much to understand the actual Israeli elections or why elections are the way they are. And I think that you also have made the mistake of allowing for fanatics and extremists, which we would both agree, I'm certainly not going to defend the racist remarks of the Shas leader, or for that matter, the policies of Avigdor Lieberman, to be a kind of reflection of a much more complex picture in Israel, where we've seen the right in general kind of move to the center much more than you were willing to admit. And that I think this sort of picking and choosing and this new narrative that Israel is sort of on the precipice maybe of becoming an undemocratic or authoritarian state is really... the latest in a very long list of narratives that are meant to delegitimize and defame Israel, and doesn't really reflect the reality. I don't think. I guess I'm unpersuaded by your call for alarm.
You can be unpersuaded, but I would like you to acknowledge that the epicenter of this argument, the place from which this argument radiates, certainly for people like me, and I think for other liberal Zionists, is Israel. It's Haaretz. It's columns like Akiva Eldar. It's the people who blog for Koteret. That's where this argument is made in a much stronger form, in fact, than you tend to find. Right. So I think that's where it comes from people who are in Israel who are genuinely concerned about the liberal character of the state.
You're right. There are some Israelis who are very concerned about the liberal character of the state. They started voicing their concerns in the late 1970s with Benny Morris, the New Post-Zionists, the New Histories. And you're right. There is a small minority of Israelis, probably 3 or 4% at this point, that are taking your view, just as there is a small minority of Israelis who are fanatical extremists on, in hilltops in the West Bank who are doing all kinds of terrible things. Israel it contains multitudes. It is a big country. I would say, however, that the center of Israeli politics is not a fascist center. It's a democratic center. And it had an election, and it's had a lot of elections, and what it said is that basically it doesn't believe in the Meretz labor argument anymore. It feels that it just doesn't believe them. That is not the same thing as saying that it's also, I think, simultaneously render the judgment that it can't hold on to the Palestinian territories for a long time. But I just think you misdescribed it.
I didn't say the Israeli center was fascist, but I do think that Avigdor Lieberman is not a marginal figure. He's got the third biggest party. He's the deputy prime minister. He's Netanyahu's protege, and he's got particular support amongst the youth. Shas is not marginal either. So, and the polling suggests, there's just poll after poll after poll, which shows, just the frighteningly high percentage of Israelis. 60% who don't want to live in an apartment building with an Arab. 40% who don't want Arab Israelis to vote, to suggest that there are very, very troubling, 50% who want to encourage Arab Israelis to emigrate, to suggest that there really is troubling stuff there. Whether it's really penetrated the center of Israeli politics, maybe not yet, but I think it's moving in that direction, and I think Lieberman and Shas are evidence of that, and that's why I think it has to be resisted with everything we have.
Well, in the 1980s, we saw that there was a party led by Meir Kahane that favored moledet and transfer, which is...
Yeah, but it didn't. Meir Kahane was never deputy prime minister of Israel, Eli.
Well...
it was banned.
What? Well, eventually
it was banned. That really was marginal. Lieberman's not marginal.
Well, I don't think Lieberman and Meir Kahane are the same guy by any stretch.
No, they're not.
I'm not going to defend... I'm not going to get into
they're not the same guy. Of course they're not the same guy.
It's not my politics, and they're not the same. But I want to just point something out. When his legislation or his legislative initiative, which I'm not necessarily endorsing, is a response to members of the Israeli parliament who are Arabs, who participate in the Israeli parliament, who then go to Cyprus and meet with members of Syrian intelligence or members of Hezbollah or other organizations devoted to destroying Israel. Now, all I'm saying is that if we had members of the U.S. Congress meeting with Al-Qaeda, there might be some people who would propose saying that they can't do that sort of thing. Now, I don't like loyalty oaths. I'm not for the oil, but put it in context. Put it in context.
Yeah, but not all of his policies, Eli, first of all, are just directed at those. A lot of them are directed simply at innocent Arab Israelis. For instance, the law that would make it impossible for Arabs from outside of Israel who marry Arab Israelis to get citizenship. And we did have some members of Congress. They're not my favorite members of Congress, like McDermott, I think, member from Washington, who went to meet with Saddam Hussein. And I think you and I would have both been appalled at the idea that they should have been, stripped of their position in Congress.
Well, we actually do have a law. We do have a law in the United States, which I think is the Bacon Act or something like that, which would never been enforced, which says that it's illegal for members of Congress or any U.S. to conduct foreign policy outside of the executive branch. As you know, it's never been enforced. However, I'm not trying to downplay it. I'm just saying that it's in the context of that's sort of what Lieberman is defending, and I don't want to. And I said to myself, I said at the beginning, and I'm saying it now. I'm not going to defend.
No, and one of the heartening things for me, frankly, about the whole response to my piece is that I've had almost nobody who has been defending him, and I think that's terrific. I guess what I would hope is that people would move from beyond not just defending him to, in fact, actually seeing the opposition to him and taking him seriously as a very disturbing force, rather than saying what I think people tended to say is, well, he's really obnoxious, but he's marginal. I fear that actually he and what he represents is really more than marginal at this point.
Well, all right, with this last part of it, this is one of the things is that if you're going to point out that there are the extremists on the right in Israel that are really problematic, then I think you're right, you don't get that. But see, this is coming where you've got, for example, again, I'm a journalist, so I'm not going to come and say that everything that Israel did in the Gaza war was justified and terrific and wonderful, and I don't think that's my job to do that. But I would say this, when you have human rights groups, or Goldstone for that matter, not acknowledging that Hamas presents Israel with a horrible choice, which is that it's an enemy that seeks to maximize the civilian casualties on its own side by the placements of its rockets, by the fact that it uses ambulances to transport suicide vests. All of these problems, to not even acknowledge that this is a huge issue for Israel, which is what a lot of folks did. That's I would describe as sort of the Andrew Sullivan approach to Israel. To not even acknowledge that this is a challenge or an issue, it kind of comes on the heels of that. And that's what I think, you should be very wary of, Peter, because there are people who are going to use this New York Review of Books essay to say, look, there's not much of a difference between Hezbollah and Israel. They've got their right-wing fanatics. Hamas has its right-wing fanatics. It's all morally equivalent.
Well, sure. So there are people who use it in all kinds of ways. But, I mean, I guess I would just say I think it's, first of all, it's not fair to say the Gaza war did not criticize Hamas's actions. It absolutely did. The Goldstone Report Commission was, of course, limited by the fact that Israel would not have anything to do with it. And I think my position would be what the Israeli human rights position was. 9 groups basically said that Israel has this incredible, inspiring tradition of basically appointing these Supreme Court justices to do these independent commission reports. They did it after Shabbat Shatila. They did it after the killing of a number of Arab Israelis at the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000. They did it with the Winograd Commission report in Lebanon. That's what Israel should have done when the Breaking the Silence troops came forward with a whole series of accusations about what happens in Gaza. And it really, frankly, breaks my heart that the Israeli government didn't do that again. Probably what would have happened would have been the commission would have basically made various criticisms of certain people in the Israeli government or in the military, just as they did with Winograd, as they did in the Orr report in 2000. And Israel would have been in so much of a better position than the stupid, self-defeating position it's taken, I think, and it's ultimately led to this situation where you have people trying to keep Goldstone from going to his own grandson's bar mitzvah.
All right, listen, you don't conflate the position of the Israeli government with a couple of activists in South Africa.
You have to. I really think that was Dershowitz can we complete when Dershowitz said that Goldstone is a traitor to the Jewish people, which I thought was an appalling statement. I mean, he had just been to visit with Netanyahu and been offered the UN ambassadorship of Israel. So I think a lot of this really is coming from the Netanyahu government.
No, there is a real frustration on the part of most Israelis to feel that everything about their country, when they're fighting what they consider to be, and which is, by the way, in many ways, a very depraved and cynical enemy in Hamas and Ahmadinejad and so forth, to constantly sit and judge them against this, what they consider at times to be an impossibly high moral standard. And they see it as an attempt to, no, wait a second.
Go ahead.
The fact that Goldstone is not going to even acknowledge that Hamas was placing its rockets in civilian areas and that its military headquarters were deliberately near schools and other sorts of it's the fact that it doesn't acknowledge any of that when the Israelis have plenty of video footage from their drones.
Did the Israelis give Goldstone that video footage?
What?
Did the Israelis give Goldstone that video footage?
Well, I mean, the Israelis didn't participate in the Goldstone report.
Well, that's exactly the point.
They saw it as a fixed story, as a kangaroo report, because it's commissioned by the Human Rights Commission, which doesn't look at anything from Sudan to North Korea or anything else like that, and focuses everything on Israel. It decides to put this guy out there who he used to be a Jew, who's going to come out there and say, I wonder why did they bomb all these civilians? Maybe it's because they wanted to bomb the civilians. I mean, come on.
Look, Eli, just to be clear, my position is there would never have been a need for the Goldstone Commission report if Israel had acted with its own best tradition of appointing an independent investigation. That's what should have happened. Once Israel refused to do that, and they refused to if they had all this great evidence to show the Goldstone Commission report about then why didn't they do that? Goldstone is not an Israel hater. He's a trustee of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He wrote the document that basically gave him his own mandate. I just don't understand why it's been incredibly self-defeating the way the Netanyahu government has handled this whole thing. It would have been so much better if they'd done an internal investigation as the Israeli human rights community wanted.
Right.
I mean, do you agree with that? Do you think that Israel should have done its own investigation in independent way?
Not in the current. Israel. Listen, Israel has its own means for correcting these sorts of injustices, and I suppose that there should have been some sort. And I think there has been.
There was an
the IDF side has looked.
The
IDF side has looked into it, but don't try to change the topic. People are using Goldstone to try to say that Israel was deliberately trying to kill Palestinian civilians when the opposite is true. You had an aggressor from Gaza who wanted more than anything to create more dead Gazans, which is why Hamas is the problem. Getting back to, let's turn it around to your position. Why is the New America Foundation still wanting to legitimize this group Hamas, which is an interest in maximizing Palestinian casualties and killing Jews? It's just a problem.
Look, I don't think the New American Foundation has any corporate position on this. I can't speak for others, but I'm certainly not trying to.
Why does George Soros want to recognize Hamas? I'm just saying that we live in Israel lives in a world where it's got a lot of enemies.
I've never met George Soros. What I said, and now maybe we are going around in circles, is that I think the better thing to do would have been to support Hamas's inclusion in a Palestinian unity government that basically, in a way, accepted Israel's right to exist and certainly committed itself to a ceasefire and continue the negotiating process. And I think going down that path would have we at least should have tried that path rather than leading to the situation which has become so tragic and so horrible for the people of Sderot, for the children of Sderot, and for the people of Gaza who've seen half of their hospitals destroyed, who are now basically all 80% now dependent on food aid. I think at the very, very least there was an obligation by both the United States and Israel to try to seek every political avenue in response to Hamas's victory. I just don't think they did that.
All right. Well, on that note, I guess we sort of agree to disagree. On that note, I mean, on a lot of things. Thank you for doing this, Peter.
Thank you.
And we will see each other soon. And thank you again for watching Blogging Heads, people.
Take care.
Okay, thanks. Bye.